Since we don't know your earlier work, before the spills, could you describe what it was like?
What I really liked about those pieces was that they were really fun to do. You know, you could just, there was like no labor involved. I would just pile things up or tie things together, pour stuff in a bag. And so I was really into this idea there was no labor, and that the process of the work kind of went hand in hand with the content. And so that was really liberating for me. I mean, a lot of people work with found objects, but I think it was an important kind of step for me. Eventually, I just got tired of it just being about decay, and I wanted to bring in this more, regenerational aspect to the work, and I started pouring the dye into these open containers, and that led to it being more spill.
Do you ever make objects before this, or you've always been kind of an installation artist, or not focusing on the object making?
Well, I always made sculpture, but I always had problems with objects, like I really didn't like art for a long time. Like, I don't know why I became an artist. I think it was because my mother told me to go to art school. She said, what should I do? She goes, why not study art? And I'm like, okay. Because when I was in high school, I wanted to be a rock star. I used to play lead guitar. So I really didn't have this relationship to objects, and I never really understood the whole thing about an art object until one time I went to the Met and saw the New Zealand wing. And then at that moment I had this like epiphany that objects could transmit energy. Mm-hmm. And that was when I kind of, I was like, oh, okay, it's okay to make objects if they transmit energy.
Tell us about the materials that you choose, because I know that your spills are very specific in the materials that you use. And could you also tell me why you chose these materials?
Well, I deliberately chose the flour and the salt because, first of all, it evokes this memory of childhood, like baking with my mother, and then that's one reason why I chose it. The other reason why I chose it is because it's this very elemental material, and it's very available, and it's like a benign substance. It's like doesn't emit toxic fumes, hopefully, or anything like that. It has this relationship to domesticity rather than, it doesn't have this industrial avocation. So I like that about it. The way I want to approach my work, I want it to be consistent with like ideas that I have about the world, and I think that using this material that is available and isn't like a dominating material over nature, but has this more relationship to it.
So the choice of, you use like flour and salt, all organic materials.
Right,
basically.
It's all organic, yeah.
So is this coming from an ecological perspective? Or another thing it can be looked at, these are all used domestic materials used for cooking.
Right.
Which would be coming from a feminist perspective. And one doesn't disassociate or deny the other one. But I'm wondering what perspective you're coming from.
As we were talking about before, I just didn't really have this relationship to objects. Like, I don't really relate to them, like just stuff. I just hate stuff, Mm-hmm. But I have this relationship to something that's to me, it's like alive, and it's in a transforming state. Therefore, I have this whole history with this material, and I understand it because I've experienced it all my life. And I don't have that kind of relationship to like art supplies. It's just this product that you buy, and you're supposed to be using it for your art, but it doesn't mean anything to me. Mm-hmm. This is something that means something to me.
So would you consider yourself an alternative art maker? Because of the lack of objectiveness, in the 80s, everything focused around materialism. fabrication, high tech. And you started doing these, I believe, in the early 90s?
Mm-hmm.
Would
Yeah.
this be in response to it, or just totally, you just weren't focused?
A lot of the 90s artists are influenced by the ideas that were brought up in the 80s, and I mean, that's why a lot of people were sort of rejecting painting for a while, and they were rejecting this idea of, you know, heroic marks on a canvas or whatever. And they were rejecting aesthetics, you know, everything was sort of anti-aesthetic in the 80s, or within certain factions, particularly the women artists, like, that were doing the most innovative work, were rejecting all of that. But, I mean, so I was, you know, very much aware of all those ideas, but I also felt like, well, there's still pleasure, I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong in aesthetic pleasure, you know, that just because you take that out doesn't mean that it's no longer a commodity. I mean, you know, it's just like that was one stage, and now the next stage is like, how do you put the pleasure back into it without it having these, you know, problematic issues. So, I mean, the way of dealing with that was to make it more commonplace, you know, dealing with these more commonplace materials. And, I mean, that's what a lot of artists are doing now. They're using these really fragile, you know, everyday kinds of materials, that sort of things that previously were debased or considered too feminine or something like that to be taken seriously.
Can I ask you, what is a feminist perspective?
Well, I think that the way I feel about it is that I don't think there is enough femininity in the world. You know, like if you go outside and you look around, everything is sort of taken from this sort of more masculine point of view. And the feminine things are sort of confined. And I don't think it's particular to men or women or anything like that, you know. I just think that it would be nice if there were like more things in the world that had this perspective. And therefore that's why I think I want to put it out. You know, that's why I use cloth and fabric, because it has this relationship to something that not only wasn't like invented by women, but also it is inherently feminine, and the approach is feminine. And that doesn't mean that only women have done it or whatever. But you know, this is like an approach that I would like to see more of, just in everything, you know, like in architecture or in like the way we make tools or in the way we build things, you know. Just don't think there's enough of that out there. I mean, and it's kind of annoying that you know, like everything you buy, it's sort of like it was made for a guy or something, you know. You go out and it's all like made, it's designed by men for men.
When I come in and I see the spills, one of your installation pieces, it crosses my mind whether these are bodily fluids coming through like menstruation, or if this is regurgitation, vomit, a violent gesture against something, or if it's kind of a celebratory ritual.
Well, I don't see it as violent in that way. I mean, I definitely don't see it as vomit. I think it's like rebellious. I mean, the act of pouring this stuff on the floor, particularly in a gallery space or in a public space, where it's like our perspective on culture is to like kind of seal out nature so we can be protected from it. So by bringing this like kind of uncontrollable phenomenon into a public space, you know, is kind of naughty gesture or something like that. And then, you know, and it's the material itself is autonomous, and like a lot of people think you know, that I want the materials to decay or something. Well, but I don't. I mean, the reason I use salt is it's preservative and it prevents it from, you know, going rotten. But what I wanted the material to have this autonomy to it.
So far, your spills have been within the confines of a gallery. or room space? Does it have to be within a room? Can it go outside of the room? Could you pour it into an open space outside into the environment?
Well, I'm doing a project like that in the spring, but one thing that I realized when I was there was that my work can't really exist in nature. I mean, it exists more in relationship to architecture. So the way that I'm dealing with that is to deal with the outside of the building.
In the last year or two, you've started taking them off the floor. You've done pours on gauze and fabric.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have sewing involved with them. Why have you started to do these? And how do they interact with each other?
Well, I mean, I've always, done studio work, and I've always done the installations together. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. And when I first started doing the spills, I also was pouring smaller spills onto gauze, but then those pieces were presented on the floor. And then I guess a year or so later, I started to make things that hung either like near the wall or on the wall. They were more vertical. And I guess the thing that I objected to about working on the wall was that, it seemed kind of isolated or confrontational. It didn't seem to have any relationship to the architecture. And then when I started doing these, I realized that I could have this relationship to the wall without, because of the way these are made, they're kind of like a script, and they have these openings,
Mm-hmm.
so you can see through to what's behind them. And then also the shape relates to the shape of the wall, and the fabric kind of, moves around. So therefore, it has this interactive quality because it's going to change every time you move it to a different space.
Mm-hmm.
And it also could be presented, upside down or, in a different relationship to the wall. It could be near a door or a window or,
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it has this quality that's in keeping with my whole project. So there's no reason for it to have to go on the floor now that I've kind of realized that this could happen.
So are these, when I saw a piece of yours, an installation last year, and you had these pieces hanging over
Mm-hmm.
the spills. And I wasn't sure if there was a dialogue going on between the two, if one was a result of the other. For example, the cloth pieces up in the air could be either a gaseous cloud coming from vapors from the spill, or the spill could be a result of the cloud. Are they two different
They're like two
expressions?
different planes
They are.
that are kind of operating together. I mean, I fill those sacks with the liquid, and then it drips down, and then it has an effect on the floor, but it's not made exclusively from just coming from above, but it affects what's happening below.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When we experience your work, are we supposed to be experiencing them as paintings or as sculpture, or do you have any specificity about how these are supposed to be experienced? Or do you even care how you're experiencing them? Is this a question or a concern of yours?
And you're referring to these pieces?
Yes, I guess because you make these on the floor. It's a gestural,
Mm-hmm.
like action painting,
Right.
and then they go up on the wall. But they're also made with materials, solids that become solids, like flour, like eggs, like salt. So what do you consider yourself? Do you fit in any to the typical traditional categories of sculptor, painter, abstract, gestural painter?
Well, I mean, some people refer to these as paintings, and I don't care if people do, but, I mean, they're not. I mean, and the thing that distinguishes my work from painting is, the autonomous edge.
In terms of fitting into the mainstream of art, is that a concern? I mean, of yours, I guess...
Well, you mentioned alternatives before,
Right.
and I think that's definitely, I mean, something that I thought about, like, as you said, in the early 90s. I mean, it seemed like that the 80s were sort of about critique and reflection, and I think in the 90s people are attempting to offer alternatives. I mean, not that we have any, like, notions about changing the world, or, I think that's the other thing about people in the 90s is, like, they're doing it, but then they also are, like, really aware of what they're doing and the humor in it, and where they're placed in terms of culture as artists and how artists function in culture.
I know you've shown in Europe, and you've shown a lot in New York, and do you find that there's a different public response? And how do you find the public responding to this, outside of the alternative world in New York?
I think the response to my work has been really, positive. And when I first started showing in New York, I guess a lot of people would step in the spill. And I don't know if it was just the way I was making them, or it was just, or the fact that people just couldn't deal with this phenomenon that seemed to them to be taking over the space or something. And I noticed in Europe people never really stepped in it. They were very careful.
Have you shown outside of New York City?
Yeah. I've shown in Illinois, I guess, in this country.
How was the response outside of?
There were more, I mean, I guess they thought it was weird or gross or something.
Do they look at you as are you labeled as a feminist artist?
I think I'm labeled as anything, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people talk about feminism, but, the thing is, and this is something that I wanted to be so in my work, that you don't really have to know anything about feminism or know anything about painting or any other subject for that matter to get something from the work. I mean, you walk into an installation and it's very experiential. It's a sensory experience.
So it's not a gender thing, it's a experiential thing.
Yeah, and if you look further, you can find these other things within it. But one thing that made me really happy is someone told me that when I had my show at 303, there were these people standing out on the street, and I guess they were just like these guys that lived on the street or whatever, and they were telling people to go up to see my show.
Really?
Yeah, and I was like, wow, that's so great. I was just so happy that, my work would appeal to people that, don't have an art background. Of course, that's probably not far from the case most of the time, because let's face it, most people just are really turned, there's just this real block about art. I mean, most people who aren't involved in the art world, they don't go to museums or galleries.
No, I'm not sure how much of an interest there is in anything that's outside of the mainstream. I find your things very beautiful, bordering on the seductive. Okay, could you
bordering on
bordering
on the seductive?
Becomes personal, but could you talk about beauty and where? I mean, for me, it's evident or prominent in a lot of your work. So could you talk about what you think about beauty and where it fits in?
Well, I mean, it's going to sound really cliche, but I guess I'm striving for this kind of balance between my own intention and, like I said, the autonomy of the liquid. So, if I want there to be this gesture, but I want all these other elements to kind of come into it to make it, spontaneous and free. And I guess when that happens, then it's beautiful. Another thing that distinguishes like the work of the 90s from like the work of the 70s, because obviously a lot of the artists now like are inspired by that time and kind of came of age at that time.
I think beauty can be taken as a negative thing, and if we're going to, and I'll make the analogy to women being beautified or objectified from their beauty.
Right.
And then there's this idea of if something is beautiful, it's not serious. So I think perhaps that for some female artists, they might find it a problem to make something beautiful, or male artists now, even today. Aestheticism is a problem.
Well, I think the reason, I mean, the whole reason why I think a lot of women are making their work kind of more, quote, beautiful now, you know, it's a very deliberate thing, you know, like why a lot of artists are using things that are really girly, you know, in their work, because it's something that previously wasn't accepted, and things that are beautiful then could be coined as, quote, decorative, or, quote, not serious. And why are these things considered that way? Because they're considered to be feminine. So it's sort of like it's trying to break that whole, break down that whole way of thinking, that a lot of women artists are making things that are sort of beautiful in this kind of feminine way. But also, I think that others, first of all, what's wrong with decorative? What's wrong with being decorative? I mean, what's wrong with decoration?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, there's nothing wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing not serious about it. I mean, why is it more serious to you know, to do a collage of newspaper clippings than it is to draw a pattern, you know? It's like, are you not using your brain when you're making some kind of aesthetic, formal decision? And also it's so subjective in terms of like the time. I mean, because, you know, it's been how many years since Duchamp, you know? And people are still kind of reiterating the same things that he brought up, but now it's decorative. I mean, now, like, collectors and, like, architects are placing these objects in people's homes, and they have this innocuous place within the decor. I mean, they're decorative. I mean, it's no different if you're making this painting that has all these colors that match the sofa. Well, you know, a Ryman fits in perfectly with, like, the contemporary architects, you know. I mean, it was radical in its time. So, I mean, it's all so affected by time and place that, I mean, I think that whole argument is just, you know, really null and void.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't apply anymore.
So could something, would it bother you if your work was just taken on the aesthetic level? Could it just stand on its own as a beautiful
Well, I don't
piece
think,
of work?
I don't think it can, because, I mean, if it did, people would be buying it, and nobody is.
Well,
but maybe, you know, in a certain amount of time, I mean, like, you look at some Pollocks and you think of, like, batik or tie-dye or whatever, you know? And so, you know, maybe after a certain amount of time, I don't know how long it'll take, it probably will be considered that. But right now, there's this suspicion, I guess.
Well, which brings me to another question I would like to ask you, and they're entwined, the ephemeral. Because the ephemeral can be very beautiful and fragile, and yet it's even harder to get people to understand and, let's say, invest in it, whether on an emotional or a financial level, because it is so ephemeral. You know, and I think you have a combination of all these things, which make it experiential on a fantastic level. The ephemeral has been negative. When people talk about feminist work and it's ephemeral, I think about women's positions, women's roles in society.
Well, okay, this is why, one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of put my work on the wall, because, you know, I was thinking, well, the ideas that I'm dealing with are these ideas, these are not things that I want to disappear, you know, that what I want is to have a place for these ideas within our culture. I mean, it's not like you were asking about alternatives. It's like, yes, I want to present an alternative, and I want that alternative to be available in culture, not something that is like completely irreverent of it.
The ephemeral, the beauty, everything I see in your work for myself is like a metaphor for the feminine. Because It's very beautiful, it's gentle, experiential, fragile. And the spills, unfortunately, would also dry up and they were gone. And when I talk about the roles of women, I think about childbearing and nurturing and all these things that basically don't have any marketability in society. I mean, they don't. You know, there's no value put on them, and therefore there's no real value for the roles of women. And so I was wondering if you think there is any metaphor here.
Well, I mean, it's not like I'm really going for that metaphor, but I think that explains why that I've achieved all of this like success in terms of like notoriety, but my work isn't selling.
The last question I'd like to ask you is, where do you think your work will be going? What direction are you moving towards?
Well, it seems that I'm kind of expanding on some of the materials. So I guess it's just becoming more, I don't know. I can't really say, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'm starting to use this egg white powder, which I'm going to add to the spills. And it seems like I'm just, in terms of like, technically, I'm starting to figure some things out.
Will you be moving away from the floor spills and more onto things that can actually go onto the walls and be taken off the walls, things that have more lifespan to them, I guess?
Well, I think I'm going to continue doing both, doing installations and doing more discrete studio pieces. So I'm going to continue with that. I'm doing like this outdoor piece in Portugal that I'm really excited about. So that's kind of new.
So you will be moving outside of the gallery space and into other directions?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Is that okay?
Good. Really good.
Yeah,
Perfect timing.
I know. I had to move my leg. I was like,
Versace when I throw it to stop myself coughing.
oh, do you have a cold?
Yeah.